At its peak, RadioShack had over 7,000 stores across the United States. 7,000. There was a time when you were never more than a few minutes from one. They were in strip malls and shopping centers and small downtown blocks in towns that barely had anything else. At one point, the company claimed it reached nearly a third of all American households every single year, and then, in 2015, it filed for bankruptcy, the second time. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Think about what those numbers actually meant. 7,000 stores. That is more locations than most fast food chains had at the time. More than most banks. More than most churches in the country, probably. RadioShack was not just a store, it was infrastructure. And it was part of the physical fabric of American life in a way that almost nothing else was, and almost nobody talks about that now. You could drive through a small town in rural Kansas with one gas station and one diner, and there, tucked into a strip mall next to a laundromat, was a RadioShack. It was everywhere. It was assumed. It was just part of what America looked like. And then it was not. Here is what those numbers cannot tell you. They cannot tell you what it felt like to walk into one. You remember the door, the way it opened into something that smelled faintly like solder and plastic and electronics still in their packaging. A specific smell. Not unpleasant, industrial, but somehow cozy. The carpet was usually a little worn near the entrance. The lighting was bright but not harsh, and the moment you stepped inside, you were surrounded by things, not products in the modern retail sense. Things, components, possibilities. There were resistors in tiny labeled drawers stacked along one wall like a card catalog from a library that only stocked the future. There were AA batteries in bulk packages and 9-volt batteries and those flat-watch batteries in a little spinning display. There were cables you didn't know you needed and cables you had been searching for everywhere. RCA adapters, coaxial splitters, speaker wire sold by the foot, soldering irons, multimeters, scanners that could pick up police frequencies and weather bands and things you weren't entirely sure were legal to listen to. Remote control cars with a price tag that made you hesitate and then reconsider and then stand there holding the box for 10 minutes. Walkie-talkies, transistor radios, phone cords, joysticks, CB radios, personal computers that looked like science experiments, antenna kits, oscilloscopes you could actually afford, alarm system components sold individually so you could build your own, intercoms, clock kits, guitar effects pedals, and in the very back, past everything else, a wall of speakers in different sizes and price ranges that the guy behind the counter could actually explain to you in terms that made sense. That guy was the whole thing, really. He wore a name tag. He had probably worked there for years. He knew the store the way a librarian knows a library, not just where things were, but why they existed and what you could do with them together. He could look at the project you described, the broken stereo, the antenna you were trying to build, in the circuit you were attempting for a school assignment, and walk you to exactly the right drawer and hand you exactly the right part and explain why, not in a condescending way, in a genuinely interested way, like your problem was interesting to him, like he had been waiting for exactly this kind of question. He was not a sales associate in the hollow modern sense. He was a resource. He was the human index to everything in that store. He was the reason you left feeling smarter than when you came in. RadioShack, at its best, was a place where curious people could do real things. That is the whole story, actually. Everything else is detail. The origin goes back to 1921, when a company called RadioShack opened in Boston to sell amateur radio equipment. And the name came from the small wooden structures built on ships and early airplanes to house radio transmitting gear. Those shacks were cramped and functional and full of wires, and the name carried that same energy. Ham radio was new and exciting and slightly dangerous feeling in those early decades, and the people who wanted it needed a place to find it. The store served them. It was niche from the beginning. It was built for people who wanted to understand how things worked, not just use them. For decades it stayed that way, small, specific, trusted by a particular kind of person who was deeply loyal because there was simply nowhere else like it. Then, in 1963, a Texas company called Tandy Corporation bought it. And Charles Tandy was a leather goods businessman who saw RadioShack's assets going cheap during a rough financial stretch and recognized something others had missed. The stores had a loyal customer base. The brand had real credibility among hobbyists and engineers and tinkerers. The catalog was deep. All it needed was someone willing to scale it aggressively and manage it tightly. Tandy was exactly that person. He was a relentless operator. He believed in vertical integration, in owning the supply chain, in controlling your own products. He was not a tech visionary. He was a merchant who understood margins and loyalty and the power of having a store on every corner. Through the late 1960s and the 1970s, RadioShack expanded at a pace that was almost disorienting. New stores opened constantly. The catalog grew thicker every year. The company started producing its own branded electronics under the Realistic and Archer and Macronta labels, which let them keep prices competitive and margins healthier than almost any competitor. A Realistic stereo receiver was not glamorous, but it worked, and it cost less than the Japanese imports at the department store across the parking lot, and you could buy it from someone who could answer your questions. By the late 1970s, RadioShack was the dominant consumer electronics retailer in the country. Nothing else came close. And then came 1977. RadioShack released the TRS-80, a personal computer, one of the first mass-market personal computers ever sold in the United States. And it cost around $600, and it ran on a Zilog Z80 processor, and it came with 4 kilobytes of RAM and a cassette tape drive for storage and a monitor and a keyboard, and you could buy it at any RadioShack location in America. No special order. No waiting list, no trip to a specialty dealer in a big city. You walked in and you bought a computer. That was extraordinary. Apple was selling the Apple II the same year, but you had to find an Apple dealer, and there were not that many of them. The TRS-80 was everywhere. RadioShack had the stores, the infrastructure, the trained sales staff, the catalog network. They sold around 100,000 units in the first year, which was an almost unimaginable number for personal computers at that moment in history. Schools bought them. Engineers bought them. Teenagers bought them and stayed up all night typing programs out of magazines and saving them to cassette tapes that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. For a brief time, RadioShack was the most important computer retailer on the planet. Not a footnote, not a competitor, the most important one. The decline did not happen all at once. It never does with places like this. It started quietly, with decisions that looked reasonable at the time. Through the 1980s, the personal computer market got more competitive and more fragmented. RadioShack kept making their own computers, the Color Computer, the Model 100, the Tandy 1000, and some of them were genuinely excellent machines. The Tandy 1000 was probably the best IBM-compatible computer you could buy for the home in 1984. But the IBM PC and its clones were winning the business market. Apple was winning the creative and education markets, and the game was getting expensive. RadioShack was spending heavily to compete in a category where the margins were shrinking and the competition had deeper pockets, but they still had the components. They still had the parts drawers and the cables and the speaker wire by the foot and the knowledgeable staff. That part still worked. That part was still irreplaceable. The real damage came from a decision made in the name of growth. In the 1990s, RadioShack looked at the emerging cellular phone market and saw the obvious future. Wireless phones were going to be everywhere. Millions of Americans were about to buy their first mobile phone, and they would need somewhere to buy it, and RadioShack had 7,000 locations ready and waiting. The company reorganized its entire retail strategy around selling wireless phone contracts. The components moved to the back. The parts drawers shrank. The training programs changed. The whole orientation of the store shifted. You walked in and someone asked you immediately if you needed a phone plan. That was the job now. Sell plans, earn commissions, move contracts, get the customer signed up, and get to the next one. The guy who knew everything about electronics became the guy who read from a script about monthly data limits. The drawers of resistors were still there for a while, dusty and quiet near the back wall, but nobody was talking about them anymore. The store looked similar on the outside, but it felt different the moment you walked in. The conversation had changed, the attention had changed, and the soul of the place had quietly been rerouted. That was the trade. That was the exact moment. It looked like a rational business decision because cellular phones were genuinely exploding. The math seemed obvious. More customers, bigger transactions, recurring revenue from contracts, everything a retailer wants. But here is what the math missed. The people who came to RadioShack for parts and knowledge and components had nowhere else to go. There was no other RadioShack. There was no backup. When RadioShack stopped being that place, they did not find a replacement. They did not transition happily to a different version of the same thing. They just lost their store. And they felt it, and they left. And because they had no reason built on loyalty to the new version of RadioShack, they never came back. Meanwhile, the people who wanted cheap phone plans had no particular reason to prefer RadioShack over anybody else. Best Buy could sell them a phone. Circuit City could sell them a phone. The carrier stores themselves could sell them a phone, often with better deals directly from the source. There was nothing that made RadioShack special in that transaction. There was no reason to drive to RadioShack specifically. So when something better came along, they left too. RadioShack had traded its irreplaceable identity for a commodity business. It had given away the one thing nobody else had in exchange for competing in a market where it had no real advantage. That is the deeper reason. Not the internet, exactly. Not Amazon, exactly. Not changing technology, exactly. Those things all played a role, but the real wound was self-inflicted. And the company chose to be something ordinary when it had spent decades being something rare. By the mid-2000s, the stores felt hollowed out in a way that was hard to describe but easy to feel. The layout had changed too many times. The staff were younger and turned over constantly and did not know the catalog the way the old guys had known it. The parts selection had shrunk to the point where you could not reliably find what you needed anymore. The branded Archer and realistic products were gone, replaced by generic accessories and phone cases and blister-packed cables that you could find anywhere. They tried different things in those final years. They ran a campaign to rebrand themselves as just the Shack, which confused loyal customers and attracted almost nobody new. They partnered with Sprint and T-Mobile and restructured the floor plan again. They chased gaming accessories and tablet cases and trendy gadgets. They brought in celebrity commercials that felt like they were made for a company that no longer knew who it was. Nothing worked. Because nothing addressed the real problem, which was that RadioShack had stopped being RadioShack long before it ran out of money. The first bankruptcy came in February of 2015. Nearly 600 locations closed immediately. A hedge fund took control of the brand. They tried a restructured version. A second bankruptcy followed in 2017. The store count dropped below 500, then below 100, then into the low dozens. A few franchise locations still exist in some form, mostly inside other stores, a brand name floating in a retail space, attached to nothing you would recognize. There is a man named Dave who lives in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, who remembers stopping at RadioShack every Saturday morning with his father in the early 1980s. His father was an electrical engineer who worked for a manufacturer on the west side of the city. He let Dave pick one component each week, anything under $2, and then they would go home after breakfast and build something with it on the kitchen table. A blinking LED circuit. A simple burglar alarm that buzzed when a wire was broken. A radio that could barely pull in one station, but that Dave had assembled himself from a kit with a paper instruction sheet and a soldering iron his father guided his hands around. He says he became an engineer because of those Saturday mornings. He says RadioShack was where he first understood that the world was not magic, that electricity followed rules, that if you learned the rules, you could make things happen that other people could not explain. He went back to the location in 2016, a few months after the bankruptcy, when the store was still technically open but clearly dying. The shelves were sparse. The drawers were mostly empty. A teenager behind the counter was staring at a phone. He bought a 9-volt battery and left. If you ever stood in front of those little labeled drawers and felt something you could not quite name, some combination of excitement and possibility and the specific pleasure of knowing exactly what you were looking for, then you already understand what was lost when RadioShack went away. It was not a store. It was permission. Permission to be curious. Our permission to take things apart and put them back together differently. Permission to believe that a 12-year-old with $2 and a Saturday morning could build something real. What do you remember about it? The smell, the drawers, the guy behind the counter, the first thing you ever built because of something you found there? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one.